everyone. I'm Antoinette.
I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Ryan.
And we're presenting Friends of Earth v. Laidlaw. Friends of Earth is plaintiff, Laidlaw defendant. Let's go like that. So before we jump into the case, a refresher on citizen suits and standing is kind of important and central to this case. So for citizen suits, any person may sue a broad category of persons, including government officials who violate legal obligations set forth in statutes, regulations, pollution control permits, all that stuff. And so just a reminder, first, when you file a claim, you have to provide a 60-day notice letter to both the target of the likely lawsuit as well as the federal and state regulators. Then, if prior or during that time federal or state officials prosecute the polluter, then citizen action is preempted and they can't bring it forward. If there are still violations, the polluter is strictly liable regardless of their good faith, negligence, or reasonableness of permit. However, if they comply with some of these things, they're still liable, but their penalties might be lowered, something along those lines. Under the Clean Water Act, polluters must self-report their compliance status. And if the citizen suit is allowed to proceed, citizen enforcers can seek injunctive relief and imposition of civil penalties. But in addition to the citizen suits, they also have to establish standing. And as we know, standing is injury in fact, causation, and redressability. It was the litigation over the content of these hurdles that took Laidlaw to the Supreme Court. So a little bit of background on how we got there. So environmental litigation in the 1970s. The court first applied the standing doctrine in the 1970s, and as we read, the Sierra Club v. Morton case, the court there rejected a public interest group's ability to seek enforcement of a law without showing tangible links to the threats to that natural resource. And then they also mentioned that recreational and aesthetic interests in environmental amenities were legit interests that were to be recognized by courts, provided that the plaintiffs could show a link between these interests and their injured interests. And so for the next decade after this case, most litigants didn't really have a problem with bringing forward these kinds of litigations, and they usually always did, which led to, in the 1980s, there was a lot of them bringing it forward. A lot of them were very active in bringing forward these citizen suit actions. And many courts by the late 1980s embraced doctrines that would reduce access to all these active environmental groups bringing forward these kind of lawsuits, because it just became a lot. And so this brought us to the 1990s, which is when Laidlaw took place. And the court was divided back then. So, for example, Lujan, which we also read, and several other 1990 standing cases that followed, both in environmental and non-environmental, were often 5-4 decisions that included multiple opinions. So when Friends of Earth decided to bring forward Laidlaw, they had to have a strategy so that the court would actually listen to them. So the for sure yeses are over here. Breyer, Souter, and Ginsburg. The maybes were Kennedy, O'Connor, and Stevens. And then the for sure no's were Scalia, Thomas. And Rehnquist was a maybe, but a mostly no. But I put him in no anyway. So choosing Laidlaw. They chose Laidlaw for the following reasons. First, the district court's finding of diligent prosecution and affirmation of the plaintiff's standing despite motion practice in a court hearing. So they already established that, and it kind of backs up their argument as to why, hey, you should listen to this because it's a problem. And also they had proof of substantial economic advantage resulting from the illegal pollution discharges. So they had proof that the Laidlaw Environmental Services were profiting from violating their permit 300 times. And also, key to that is that it involved mercury discharge, which no Supreme Court could argue was something that they could just shrug off or ignore. So this guy, he's the president of the Friends of Earth, and he said that because Laidlaw involved such a severe pollutant, mercury, it was viewed as a good precedent-setting case to revive the viability of citizen litigation for environmentalists. So, into the case.
All right, I'm going to tell you guys about the case. And so the facts, so in 86, the defendant bought the hazardous waste incinerator facility in Roebuck, South Carolina, and that included a waste treatment plant. They got the facility, and then the DHEC granted Laidlaw an NPDES permit authorizing them to discharge treated water into the North Tiger River. The permit became effective, and the permit limited discharge of pollutants, including mercury, which was a main issue here. It also, like many permits do, regulated flow, temperature, toxicity, pH, and like the Clean Water Act as a whole, required monitoring and self-monitoring and reporting. So they got their permit and they violated. Laidlaw began to discharge pollutants, exceeded the limits set by the permit, and even though they tried to fix the problem, they consistently failed to meet the permit's stringent standards. For mercury, it was 1.3 parts per billion, which is the daily average limit, and so they continued to violate. So this time frame, which is after the citizen suit was initiated, but before the district court rendered the judgment, is a really crucial time period for this case. So during then, Laidlaw violated the mercury discharge limit in its permit 13 times and committed 13 monitoring violations and 10 reporting violations. And the last violation was in January 1995, which was after the complaint but before the judgment. As a result of the violations, Friends of the Earth and another group sent the required notice, and which is required for citizen suits, and then was planning on filing the citizen suit, but before they were able to file the citizen suit, Laidlaw's lawyer contacted DHEC, who issued the permit, and asked if they would file a lawsuit. DHEC agreed. Laidlaw drafted the complaint, and DHEC paid for the filing fee. Oops. And on the last day before the 60-day notice period was up, which would mean that Friends of the Earth could file the citizen suit, they reached a settlement, which said that they have to comply and had this $100,000 civil penalty. And this is important because under citizen suit provisions, if another agency is prosecuting, then there's no reason for a citizen suit. So the court had to determine if this was adequate prosecution, and they didn't. So they said this wasn't adequate prosecution, which they talk about in the case in length, and they analyze it because it was clear what Friends of the Earth was trying to do. They were just trying to avoid a citizen suit and a long process of litigation. So the court allowed the citizen suit, and then all this motion practice started. So Laidlaw moved to dismiss because it was barred due to the other prosecution, which I already told you the court didn't fall for. And this is why they didn't fall for it. They said that the motivation was basically just to avoid litigation, that there wasn't actual prosecution. So they said it wasn't diligent prosecution. So what did the trial court find? That the trial court found that Laidlaw violated the mercury limits on 489 occasions between those dates. They said injunctive relief was inappropriate because the defendants, after the initiation of litigation, achieved substantial compliance with the terms of the discharge permit. And that's going to be a main aspect of litigation going forward, is if somebody comes into compliance after the suit is filed, is that enough to get out of penalties? And as was said earlier, that and why the court took the case, because Laidlaw benefited from this to the tune of upwards of $1 million because of this non-compliance. So the court was compelled to step in. Another main issue down the line was going to be civil penalties and if they're appropriate. So the trial court issued $405,000 of civil penalties to prevent future violations. Lastly, they declined injunctive relief because Laidlaw had been in substantial compliance, which I think I already said. Yeah, I did say that. So I'll highlight it because it's important. So the appeal, so the civil penalty was appealed, arguing that the penalty was inadequate, but they didn't appeal the injunctive relief. Laidlaw cross-appealed, arguing that Friends of the Earth didn't have standing and that they were adequately prosecuted, which the court already said they weren't. So the Court of Appeals said that the case became moot once compliance was achieved, and civil penalties would not redress any injury plaintiff had suffered. So some more about why the Supreme Court decided to take the case. There was this main discrepancy in prior cases about whether compliance after litigation commenced would be adequate to basically determine that a case is moot. And so they said, okay, we need to settle these discrepancies. So starting with the holding, the court held that mootness is a case isn't moot despite compliance after litigation has commenced, and they then put forth a really strict standard, which I'll talk about in a second. They said that the Court of Appeals incorrectly conflated the issues of standing and mootness, and that voluntarily stopping the unlawful conduct usually won't deem a case moot. The Court of Appeals also was wrong when they said civil penalties weren't appropriate because they can serve to deter future violations. Alright, so this is basically the heart of the case. So what's the difference between mootness and standing? We already said what standing was: injury, traceable, redressability. We got that from Lujan. And then there's association standing, which is a bit different, which means the members have to suffer the injury. You all remember that. I won't bore you. Laidlaw focused a lot on redressability because of the civil penalties. So they're saying Friends of the Earth had standing to seek injunctive relief, but not civil penalties, because civil penalties don't provide redress to the Friends of the Earth because the money's paid to the government. So the issue was, do civil penalties even redress the issue? And the Supreme Court said civil penalties do deter because you have to pay money and you're not going to want to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, even if it's to the government. So it doesn't matter if it's going to an organization or the government, civil penalties suffice. And they went back to Congress's intent with the Clean Water Act, which is it does more than promote immediate compliance. The goal is to be in compliance in the future and to remain in compliance. And they went right to the legislative history, which the court said Congress wanted the district court to impose civil penalties if they wanted to, and they do seek to deter future actions. More differences. So the defendant bears the burden to show something is moot, and the tough standard that the Supreme Court set forward is that the defendant bears the formidable burden of showing that it is absolutely clear the allegedly wrongful behavior wouldn't occur again, and that's a pretty high burden, especially if you violated after the initiation of the suit. So, I mean, the court has discretion to say if recurrence is possible, but that's the standard. Standing, on the other hand, is a burden that the plaintiffs bear, so they need to show the injury, the traceability, and the redressability. That's the major difference. Then what their goal is. Standing is to ensure that the scarce resources aren't overburdened, and by contrast, mootness is an issue that once the case has already been brought to determine if it still needs to be litigated. Okay, voluntary conduct, does that deem a case moot? So the Supreme Court said that voluntary cessation of the practice doesn't deprive the court of the ability to hear the case. It doesn't deem it moot. This is the standard, which I said a minute ago, and it's a pretty high burden. A case might become moot if subsequent events made it absolutely clear that the allegedly wrongful behavior could not reasonably be expected to occur. It's accepted as a very high burden. As we were taught months ago, the court in this case conflated the ideas of mootness and standing. They said Supreme Court said that the confusion's understandable because the district court said that the doctrine of standing is set in time. The requisite personal interest that must exist at the commencement of litigation is standing, must continue throughout its existence is mootness. So they conflated the ideas. They said it was set in time, meaning standing at the beginning, mootness once it's begun. We have a 20-minute limit, right?
Pretty much.
All right. Well then, Laidlaw said that civil penalties were improper. The court said, you're wrong. We're allowed to give civil penalties. They said they complied by closing it. The court said, no, they didn't. That's not compliance. Holding. Future. It's all about if you're gonna comply going forward. If there's any chance that this non-compliance is going to happen again, it's not moot. And these are nothing important, so I'm going to let Ryan talk about the aftermath for
3 seconds.
2 minutes.
Yeah. So for the aftermath, there actually was very little information available about this. So one of the things, it was cited to about 3,000 times by different courts. What's interesting is the little information, it actually says a lot. So in about 2000, Laidlaw actually went bankrupt. And looking into it, there actually were about 3 other violations or lawsuits presented in the late 90s for EPA violations. Since then, they actually had merged with this company, Safety Clean. Safety Clean now has reopened and is a waste management company now, kind of ironic. And one of the interesting things we found actually was that there's a place in California, Waste Management, where this company had Laidlaw had actually deposited 2,200 tons of radioactive material called, I think it's button willow. So that's just a fun little fact. Oh, is that where you're from?
No, not from button willow, but.
All right, but yeah, so I guess there's a bunch of radioactive material there so they've actually sold it and turned it over, but.
The radioactive material was called button willow.
Maybe it is, yeah. But yeah, so that's our presentation.
And that's Laidlaw.
That's Laidlaw.
Nice little flashback review of Gwaltney and Silico. This should hopefully sound familiar to everybody. Okay, so we finished up last time about in here looking at these 404 permit decisions and saw that the vast majority fall under these general permits, right? And general permits, this is killing me. Oh wait, there we go. There's an on switch for that. I should have told you. It's all right. That would have kept you under the 20-minute limit if you didn't have to reach out and hit it every single time. Okay, so general permits. This comes from the Clean Water Act itself. It says, in carrying out his functions or her functions related to the discharge of dredged or failed material under this section, the Secretary may issue general permits on a state, regional, or nationwide basis for any category of activity involving discharges of dredged or failed material if the Secretary determines activities in such category are similar in nature, will cause only minimal adverse environmental effect, when performed separately, and will have only minimal cumulative adverse effect on the environment. I always feel bad when I'm just reading from the slide to you, but that's what the statute says. I could like stand here and wait for you to read it. But the idea is that there are almost like categorical exclusions under NEPA, whole groups of activities that are going to happen that people are going to want permits for in the Secretary if there's only going to be minimal adverse environmental effects when they're done. Separately and cumulatively can permit all those things at once. Okay, so for the last year I looked at it, 2007, there were 45 nationwide permits, all of which are subjected to about 28 separate conditions. And these things cover all kinds of different things. Sometimes they're helpful activities. If you're creating a stock pond, if you're improving wetland conditions, improving, we talked about last time, fish conditions in small headwater streams, small disturbances in those streams. So generally environmentally helpful, but not always. Permit 39 says that residential, commercial, and institutional developers can operate under a general permit if the project fulfill half an acre or less of non-tidal wetlands. Right, so under that permit, as long as you're filling less than half an acre of wetlands, you don't need a separate permit for yourself. So you wouldn't have to go out and seek a permit. You can use the permit that the Secretary has already issued that covers all activities doing this. Does that make sense to everybody? Means we're not weighing those on a case-by-case basis, and the Secretary has determined that the total volume of these isn't going to be enough to have a really significant environmental impact. And there's different cutoffs. Sometimes you have to notify, sometimes you don't have to notify. It's actually a case we cover in admin law. So once again, if you're really interested, take admin law, and you will read more about this. All right, so moving away from the general permits, for all permits, and the EPA can veto the permit if it determines that the discharge allowed by the permit will have unacceptable adverse effects on a variety of categories: municipal water supplies, shellfish veg, fishery areas, wildlife, or recreational areas. So there's an EPA veto over the Corps of Engineers, and there's a whole kind of set of guidelines that the EPA considers when looking at whether to do this veto or not, and we'll walk through that here in a second. And then we're going to talk about 401 later today. Section 401 is kind of like we'll wait and talk about it, but it gives the states a chance to also veto these permits. All right, so the guidelines that the EPA has developed for these, we got a nice little spreadsheet, nice little flow chart from the book. So the question is, should the discharge be permitted at all? And to answer that question, the EPA says, will the discharge significantly degrade waters? If yes, then there should not be a Section 404 permit. That's kind of the EPA's core question. If not, you say, will the discharge violate state or federal laws more generally? Those laws could be state or federal water quality related laws, toxic effluent standards, pre-treat requirements, Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, National Marine Sanctuaries regulations, National Wildlife Refuge regulations, any of these other federal laws that could be tied up in that. If so, don't issue the 404 permit. If not, you consider whether there's a discharge. This discharge is going into a special aquatic site. Special aquatic sites can include sanctuaries, wetlands, or coral reefs. If yes, you ask, is the activity water dependent? Does whatever this thing is that you're doing have to be done on the water? Putting in a dock probably has to be on the water, right? Putting in a boat ramp probably needs to be on the water. Finding a place to dump trash, to dump fill materials, doesn't inherently need to be on the water. You may be able to do it someplace else. someplace to deposit mine tailings, like the Alaska case we were talking about. They're putting that into a lake. That probably doesn't inherently need to be done in the water. You could create a mine tailings pond, right? Dam up a dry site and pump that into that area instead of putting it into an existing lake. So if you say no, then you don't issue the 404 permit. If it is water dependent, then you may be able to issue the permit. So if it doesn't discharge into a special aquatic site, you say, is there a practicable alternative available? If so, then you do the 404. Then you don't do the 404. If not, then you can go ahead. The EPA will not veto the 404 permit. Practicable alternatives defined by regulation. So an alternative is practicable if it's available and capable of being done after taking into consideration cost, existing technology, and logistics in light of the overall project. So you can consider cost as you're going through and making these determinations. All right, questions on that? So that's for the EPA's decision as to whether or not to veto the 404 permit. And again, it doesn't happen very often. So 404 guidelines also prohibit discharge unless appropriate and practical steps have been taken which will minimize potential adverse impacts. That means mitigation is required for a 404 permit. Okay, a little bit different than 402 or the Clean Air Act things. If you're getting a 404 permit, you have to take appropriate and practical steps towards mitigation. Mitigation can be total avoidance, so you can only issue the permit for the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. If there's ways that don't, like we talked about, ways that don't involve discharge into a water, that's probably going to be the way you have to do it. You need to minimize the damage that you're doing and compensate for the damage that you do, meaning protect other wetlands, create new wetlands someplace else. Any one of these ways is a way to mitigate the impacts of the project. And that's, again, required under those 404 guidelines. All right, questions on that? Questions on 404 generally? Okay, that's the end of 404. So we're gonna, yeah.
What would compensation be?
Compensation means that you, excuse me, that you go in and you replace what you've destroyed. So a lot of times we'll see this. I think the law probably requires a 1-to-1 compensation. You destroy an acre of wetlands, you build an acre of wetlands someplace else. But a lot of times we'll see this at a much higher ratio. So you can do a 2-to-1 or 5-to-1, or usually it's part of your NEPA settlement negotiations. You've gotten sued over your NEPA documents. You're negotiating with the environmental groups and you agree to, like, I think I've seen up to like a 7-to-1 or 8-to-1 ratio. So for every acre destroyed, you're protecting an additional 8 acres of wetlands or creating 8 acres of wetlands. And then usually you'll pay into a bank that pays for coverage, protection of those wetlands into the future. So kind of an ongoing management role for those. All right, other questions on 404? Good, okay. So we're gonna flip back to non-point sources for a little bit. We talked a little bit about section 319, but there was a prior section here that leads into 319. Under section 208, which was part of the original Clean Water Act, states were to develop area-wide waste management plans, and they were not required to do this, but if they did this process, then they'd get federal financial assistance and technological assistance. Very few states did this, just generally didn't happen at all. And that's why we added the section 319 in 1987 to encourage states to really take this on a little bit more robustly. This expressed the national policy, again, not binding, but a national policy that programs for the control of non-point sources of pollution be developed and implemented in an expeditious manner so as to enable the goals of the act to be met. At this point, we've realized that just controlling point sources isn't enough. Most of our areas are impacted at least partially by non-point sources, and we're going to have to control those if we're going to improve water quality in those places. Federal funding for non-point source management plans is the big carrot here. Again, I think it's more money, and it's money for a wider array of activities. The state submits this non-point source management plan. EPA then approves it, and once the EPA approves it, the state gets funds for it. And these require best management practice milestones that have to be met over time for the states to keep that funding. Make sense? All good? All right, so all 50 states, the territories, and 7 tribes have now created these Section 319 non-point source management plans and have had them approved by the EPA, so they're getting some grant funds. Thus far, about 40% of the funds have gone to control non-point source pollution from agriculture. If you remember what we talked about last time in terms of impacts from non-point solution and sources of non-point source pollution, that was the big area. And if you take a look at, I think it is, what? 910 in your book, this is the same charts we looked at that lists ag as among the top 2 or 3 sources of water quality impairment in lakes, rivers, estuaries, kind of across the board. So we spent a lot of money to address non-point source pollution for agriculture, but as we see from those charts, it's largely been ineffective. Definitely not getting rid of those non-point sources, not eliminating those things. So the question becomes, what other mechanisms are there, right? What other ways can we control these non-point source pollutions or non-point source pollutants? And one of the ways that people have thrown out is the TMDL process. We talked about that so last class, 2 classes ago, I guess. And we're going to dive into that a little bit now with an actual case. And this is on 925. So in 924, it gives us a couple different kind of example TMDLs. Remember, when we have this TMDL, the way this process works, we've got our river, and we've got a stretch of the river we're concerned about for some pollutant, right? So we'll say nitrogen. Develop that TMDL. We figure out essentially how much nitrogen can go into this river in order to make sure that we're going to keep it under the amount of nitrogen that can be in there without exceeding the water quality standards, right? So we've got a use for the water, which gives us a water quality standard. If we're not meeting that standard, we say how much in added daily can still be under the water quality standard. And that is going to give us our TMDL. And as we said, we'll do the one-time figure again. So we figure out, I don't know, 1,000 pounds. So we got 1,000 pounds, that's okay. Maybe we're going to take off 10, 15% of that for the margin of safety. So we end up with 850 pounds we can actually worry about. Of that 850 pounds, we figure out the waste load allocation, the load allocation, and the background. Waste load is MPDES. This is like behind the screen. Permitted stuff. The load allocation equals non-point source pollution, and then the background is all the birds that are pooping in the water and horses peeing in the water. I guess not horses, unless there's wild horses. Whatever the natural sources are of that pollutant, right? So the natural sources of nitrogen. And so based on where these things fall out, we divide this 850 pounds among these 3 different categories. And it gives us a couple different scenarios, the Blue River and the Green River. The Green River scenario, the scenario that we're kind of looking at in Ponsalino v. Nash, is a scenario where we don't have any of these guys in there, okay? If we have no NPDES permits, all we have is the load allocation from non-point sources and the natural background amount. And in this particular case, your load allocation by itself is going to be more than the 850 pounds that you're allowed to put in there. Yeah?
How do you factor in if you have like an artificial source that's contributing to the background as well? Like for instance, if you had like a dump or something that attracts a lot of seagulls and the seagulls are pooping in the water, and you wouldn't have that seagull poop if it weren't the dump.
Right, that's a good question.
Does that kind of stuff get factored in at all? Or?
I have no idea how you deal with it, but
Will you know by Monday?
no. No, I'm not going to look into that one. If you're curious, you should look into it. But
I'm not curious enough to look at it.
neither am I. Good. Yeah, I think that's us probably playing around the margins a little bit. But you know, if you've got a lot of times these backgrounds, and especially the non-point sources, are really hard to parse out. You got a whole bunch of geese that come into this area, but you have geese because you also have cornfields that are there, right? They come in to eat the corn that's left over, or golf courses, that kind of thing. All right, so somebody want to introduce us to what's going on in Pronsolino via Nastri? Nastri? Sounds like a vampire name. Great. Who is Pronsolino, or who are the Pronsolinos? What river are we talking about? Garcia, good, it's on there, right? That should be helpful. So that's the Garcia River Basin. Get the dark green, it's forest cover on there.
They bought some old forested land and replanted it to reforested land.
So they've reforested it and now they want to log it, right? What's the Garcia River out of compliance for? What water quality standard is it not meeting? Like what? So there's a use that's supposed to be supported here in terms of water quality standard, and this water quality standard isn't being met for this river. So they,
Runoff from the road, wasn't it?
what pollutant is coming in that they're concerned about there? Sediment, yeah, right. So sediment, this is like dirt, dust, soil, little itty bitty rock, sand particles that come into the river. What use of the river do you think is impacted by sediment? Yeah.
There's fish, there's mass wastings,
Mm-hmm.
fish species die.
Perfect. So this is like coastal California, right? It's going to be trout and salmon water. So steelhead and salmon are things we're going to really care about there. Probably some listed species in there. So this use, the underlying use, California's probably designated this as a cold water fishery river that needs to be protected. For that to happen, the sediment levels have to stay pretty low. And so that gives us a water quality standard, and the water quality standard for sediment is being violated here. So they say it water quality limited river for sediment, that it doesn't meet its use because of sediment, but that means the sediment pollution is the problem. And where's the sediment coming from in this river? Logging. Yeah, logging roads, logging generally, you go in, you log, it tears up the ground, you get runoff, it moves faster over the earth, and there's no longer this kind of forest cover on the earth, and so you get a lot more sediment coming out of these systems into the river. It's a nice picture of a landslide around an old logging road on the Garcia River, so that's like right there where it actually happened. So this is classic non-point source pollution. Right? There's not a single source, like there's not a pipe that's dumping sediment, muddy water into this river. There's muddy water in the river, but it comes from all of these different sources that are all tied into logging, which is a general land use practice, not a specific instance. Bless you. All right. So this river is definitely impaired. Does California include it on its 303D list? And you're supposed to, right? You're supposed to include all of your impaired rivers. California doesn't. And why doesn't California do it?
isn't California included?
On the 303D list that it sent to the EPA.
Because all the pollution was from non-point sources.
Yeah, so California's position initially is that they don't have to report these rivers on the 303D list, and part of that 303D list is doing a TMDL, right? And so California says we don't have to do a TMDL either. We're not going to report these rivers. We're not going to do a TMDL. Does that fly with the EPA?
Probably.
Yeah, not so much, okay. So the EPA comes in and sets a TMDL on the river and adds it to the list. The TMDL they set here was 552 tons per, what is it, square mile per year. So no more than 552 tons of sediment coming in per square mile of the watershed per year. Okay, EPA establishes that, and that's a 60% reduction from what historically was happening. So how does this all impact the Ponsalinos? Yeah,
They had $750,000 worth of costs to do their project,
which is,
the harvesting of the trees.
yeah, so they want to go and harvest. They apply to California Department of Forestry for a permit to harvest this land. This is stuff they own, right? It's private land, but they have to get a permit from California. That's how California works these things. So they have to get a permit to relog the land, and then the state adds on all kinds of requirements. Like you said, it's going to cost them a ton of money to do this. Essentially, they're supposed to mitigate 90% of the controllable sediment runoff that would come from their logging sites. They can't log certain trees. There's no logging from October through May, which is our rainy season, right? That would cut way down on your sediment. It's going to cost the Ponsalinos a lot of money. So who do they sue? EPA, yeah, Nastri, which is the EPA person. And what's their argument there?
Non-point sources.
Yeah, I think you're both saying the same thing. If you only have non-point sources, Ponsalino argues, then you should not be able to do a TMDL for the watershed. This kind of boils down to, like a lot of these cases do, a case of statutory interpretation. There's a whole bunch of back and forth about what kind of deference is involved here, and a lot of it didn't make it into the version in the textbook, but they go with Chevron deference in the end. And under Chevron, they upheld the EPA's interpretation of the 303D list requirements, and include then those areas that only have load allocation, only have non-point sources. Okay, so in the end they lose, EPA wins, and you are essentially required to develop TMDLs for these rivers that are impacted only by non-point sources. All right, so question, why would you sue the feds here?
The act has a backstop provision for if the state doesn't step up, then the EPA can come in and do whatever the state doesn't do that they're supposed to.
So they can come in and do what the state was supposed to do, which in this case was what?
Regulate.
TMDLs, right? So they're supposed to do the TMDL thing. After state didn't, so the EPA came in, EPA promulgated these TMDLs. Who's actually restricting the logging?
Forest Service.
No, this is private land. It's the state, yeah, so State Department of Forestry says you can't do it the way you want to do it, and they impose all these conditions that are going to make it way more expensive. So they choose to sue the feds who actually wrote the TMDL saying you can't do this, but there are causation issues here, right? Because even if the feds develop a TMDL, that's the first question, does the state have to restrict the logging? Is the state forced to follow those TMDLs? What would happen if they didn't? Could they? Sometimes it's clear. Right? If there's point sources and you're not regulating your point sources, the EPA comes in and does it. EPA has that authority. Do they have authority to regulate non-point sources? Yeah, They aren't given that authority in the act. So if the state didn't do it, what's going to happen?
No regulation.
Well, there's no power for the EPA to regulate it. If the state doesn't do it, then you can just go ahead. Yeah.
Can the EPA just bring enforcement action against the private landowners, or?
It's not a point source.
Oh, okay.
So it doesn't reach it at all. The state's going to lose its like 319 funds, right? The grant funds that they get for having and advancing towards controlling non-point sources. So there's a carrot that induces the state to do this, but the state's not required to do it. And if the state doesn't do it, the EPA is not going to come in and do it. So the state chose to do it here, but not every state's going to make that choice. Certainly there are states that have very lax programs to address these non-point source pollutants. And so maybe they should have filed suit against the state. And so the state couldn't do this, although based on this decision, either way you went, it looks like they'd get it controlled. But remember, the state restricting this logging, they don't have that authority based on the Clean Water Act, the federal Clean Water Act. The only way they have authority is based on state law, and here is the state law around forestry. And that's where they get the power to regulate that non-point source pollution. Clean Water Act can't touch that, just doesn't touch that at all. All right, does that make sense to everybody? Questions there? The Ninth Circuit talks about this a little bit in that case, so if it doesn't make sense, go back and review that, kind of look at how the Ninth Circuit views TMDLs. And again, this is a big deal. This is just looking at California. About 1% of water quality impaired water bodies, so water bodies that don't meet the water quality standards, get their pollutants only from point sources. 54% get their pollutants solely from non-point sources in California. So those 54% are only addressed by state law. Federal Clean Water Act doesn't cover those. You have to do a TMDL for them, but that TMDL is only enforceable under state law, not under federal law. EPA can't be forced to, isn't even empowered to step in to address those. And then the last 45% are impacted by both. We'll circle back to this a little bit under section 401 also. All right, so moving to 401, this is a lot like conformity analysis under the Clean Air Act. Everybody remember conformity analysis? No, not really, kind of. So the American trucking case, where we're bringing in these trucks from Mexico, and there's a concern that letting these trucks in is going to make it impossible for states to meet their required standards under the nationally made air quality standards under the Clean Air Act. The conformity analysis means that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has to consider the impacts on air quality of that decision to let these trucks in. And that whole case is really not about that. It's about the very narrow scope of review when you're being required by the president to do something, you don't have the choice not to do it. But it brings up this idea, this problem of conformity analysis. So under the Clean Air Act, if there's a federal action, you have to make sure that federal action isn't going to keep the state from meeting its national ambient air quality standards. Same idea here. Under 401, any applicant for a federal license or permit to conduct an activity which might result in a discharge shall provide the licensing or permitting agency a certificate from the state in which the discharge originates or will originate that the discharge will comply with the applicable provisions of the Clean Water Act. No license or permit shall be granted until the certification required by this section has been obtained or has been waived. No license shall be granted if certification has been denied by the state. So if you want to get a federal permit of any kind, not just a 404 permit, but any kind of permit, so you're going to have to get a license or a permit from the feds, you have to go to the state and get a certification from the state that whatever it is you're proposing isn't going to keep that state from meeting its water quality standards. So this gives essentially the states a veto over federal permitting decisions within the state if those decisions are going to impact water quality. Does that make sense? Everybody okay with that? All right. So states issued these certifications. They have all kinds of terms and conditions. Effluent limitations, water quality-based effluent limitations, new source performance standards, essentially the same things you see in the NPDES permit. Monitoring requirements, any other appropriate requirements of state law set forth in such certification, which is awfully broad when you get to that point. And so these can get way broader than you would otherwise expect. And we see that in PUD number 1 of Jefferson County versus Washington Department of Ecology. Just to be clear, Department of Ecology is not like a university thing. It's their like state administrative agency for the environmental, or for the environment. This is on page 946. 36. There we go. 936. And while you quickly review that, I'll put up a video of this river. This is Elkhorn Canyon, the canyon just downstream of the proposed site. All right. It's just basically rafting porn, but it gives you a chance to look at your case. So. Seriously?
It's that intense and stuff like that.
It is. Wow. There we go. Pretty stout gradient. It's payback for McCaffrey's lab classes. It's a tiny little boat. No. Really? Yeah. It's just way outside of my comfort level.
Won't be taking the kids on this anytime soon.
Yeah. Just exceptionally hard to swim in something that frothy. Just continuous, and it's pretty darn full of air.
Something people do for fun.
Yes, yes. This is, I would say, the upper limits of. I have a fun theory. Type 1 fun is things that you're like, this is going to be fun, and you do it, and while you're doing it, you're like, this is fun, and afterwards you're like, that was fun. Type 2 fun is you think it's going to be fun, and then you do it, and it's not really fun while you're doing it, but afterwards, immediately, like, that was fun. And you tell all your friends, you should go do that. Type 3 fun is you think it might be fun, and you do it, and it's terrible while you're doing it. And then, like, a couple days afterwards, you're still recovering, and you're not really convinced that it was fun yet. But like maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, you're like, yeah, that was fun. And then you tell some of your friends that they should go do it. And type 4 fun, you think it might be fun and it's terrible. And then for the rest of your life, you're like, I wish I'd never done that. And that looks like type 3 fun to me, with the potential for type 4 fun mixed in there. If you come out of the boat, that would definitely be type 4 fun. All right, so what's going on here? What's the federal permit that's at issue in this case? Remember, that was the time of the video was to review the case. So I could watch the video while you all were reviewing.
Operate a hydroelectric plant.
Yeah, and so what agency do we have to get a permit for? Or from?
Environmental Protection Agency. Or the state of Washington.
Probably a bunch of permits, but the one at issue here is FERC. We have to get a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission? Yeah, commission license. We probably also need a 404 permit to put discharge materials, right, into a dam site. You probably also need a Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultation, probably a River and Harbors Act permit too, which isn't something we've covered, but you'd need a whole bunch of permits for a project like this size, right, to put a dam in. All right, so FERC, and there's actually some interesting cases around FERC where generally most, so Bureau of Reclamation, Corps of Engineers have to comply with state water law when doing a project. They have to use state water law to get the water rights they need for a project. They have to operate their pumps, their dams, all that stuff in compliance with state water law. There's a big savings clause in the Bureau of Reclamation authorizing language from 1902. And then the Corps of Engineers, for at least for irrigation purposes, not for flood control purposes, for irrigation purposes, has to comply with that same language in the 1902 Reclamation Act. FERC does not have that. So FERC has, at least on its face, a lot more authority and doesn't have to follow state water rights law when it's licensing or relicensing a dam project for energy purposes. And this whole case is kind of a story of states clawing back some measure of control over what FERC is doing here. All right, so what's the 401 issue then? Yeah, and what's the stream flow requirement?
You have a certain amount of water, like basically fish flow. You have to have enough so the fish won't die.
So it's a minimum in-stream flow requirement for the river. Is that a water quality standard?
Seems more like quantity.
Yeah, it's quantity over quality, and those are awfully tied together, especially in a state like California. But it's pretty clear that's not what the Clean Water Act set up to protect, right? You get a use, you get a water quality standard about what amount of pollutant, what amount of discharge can be added to the water. It's not about quantity. All the same, quantity can get pulled in under Section 401. So this is how the state's clawing this back. And the court reasons that Section 401D expands the scope of state certification from the discharge to the applicant and the project as a whole. So you have to get certification from the state if you're going to be discharging, but the state looks at the application as a whole. This is the language of the Act. Any certification provided in this section shall set forth effluent limitations and other limitations, monitoring requirements necessary to assure any applicant for a federal license will comply with any applicable effluent limitations and other limitations under blah, 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 and with any other appropriate requirement of state law set forth in such a certification. So if you have other state laws, in this case a minimum in-stream flow requirement for these rivers, that is going to be part of, or can be part of, that certification. And that certification becomes a condition on the federal license or permit. So even though FERC doesn't have a savings clause in their authorizing language, they're issuing federal permits. Their federal permits are covered by Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, and that requires any of those permits to get state certification, and the state, as part of that certification, can put on in-stream flow requirements. So that's how we bring FERC dams under this. This also means essentially any 404 permit that the Corps of Engineers is going to issue is going to have to go through 401 analysis, and it's going to let the state add on conditions to that 404 permit that might not otherwise be required under the Clean Water Act. Yeah.
Just as a practical application, how many times are you gonna have something where FERC is involved in a project where there's some other federal agency that there is more state control over wouldn't be?
This has actually been pretty key for the big thing now is FERC relicensing projects. So we've got all these hydropower plants that were built that had a 30-year, 40-year, 50-year license, and those are coming up for relicensing now. And so as you go through the relicensing process, that requires the state to be part of that conversation. You're not building anything new, but you're figuring out how you're going to operate this, and you're relicensing the dam. So most of the dams, most of the federal power dams in California that have been relicensed have been conditioned with these 401 permits. So you get recreational flows for boating, like we saw in that picture, and then you get flows for fish out of that.
But most of those, the Bureau of Reclamation is gonna be involved in anyways.
Sometimes, some of them are dams built by other entities. Some of them are private dams that are operated by the state. Think about all the PG&E dams that we have throughout the state. So like the dam on Lake Almanor that we talked about, it's a private dam built by some dude back in the 30s or something. But it stores up this water for hydropower purposes, and now is owned by PG&E, and so they have to get that dam relicensed by FERC. So it ends up being kind of a big deal. Definitely bigger than I initially thought it would be. All right, everybody kind of get this then, how 401's working here? Pretty good? Cool. So another 401 case, and the question, this is South D. Warren Co. v. Maine Board of Environmental Protection. And this is on 945. Is this outside of the reading? No, that's still in it, right? Good, okay. Yeah, it's not a full case for sure. Essentially just doubling down, discharge includes water flowing from a dam, from any dam, which means you can't get out of 401 just by saying, hey, this is a FERC relicensing, there's no discharge because it's just water coming out of a dam. This isn't the additions question we talked about earlier. This is just the discharge from the dam because 401 talks about any discharge in the navigable waters, and so that discharge, the court said in that case, includes water being released from a dam, regardless of what's in that water. So this is the next thing we saw. Was a case, Oregon Natural Desert Association v. Dombach, where folks were trying to, and I think this is outside of your reading, right? You guys read Oregon?
Yeah.
You did? Were you supposed to read Oregon? I guess I should know the assignment. Good. Excellent. I like it when I actually make sure these line up. Good job, past me. So, there's an argument here that the 401 says is any discharge into navigable waters. That's a lot different than what we see under the General Clean Water Act, which says discharge of a pollutant, and then we have to say what's a pollutant, and discharge of a pollutant is defined as a discharge from a point source. And so there's an argument that any discharge into navigable waters could mean non-point source pollutants. So the thought was, in this case, was to bring those non-point source pollutants under 401 and give folks a way to get at least some non-point source pollutants. The specific example in Oregon Natural Desert Association was the grazing rights. So if you've got cattle going in a stream, cattle pooping and peeing all around the stream, that results in all kinds of non-point source discharges, right? Both from the certain points of the cow. I think there's 2 of them at least. But more of them breaking down the bank as they wade around, eating shoreline vegetation. All that increases runoff, increases particularly sediment loads, but also nutrient loads in those streams. So the argument here is that before you can issue a permit for grazing or for getting these cattle onto national forest land, BLM lands, any of those areas, you should go undertake a 401 analysis to look at the non-point source impacts. Court shuts it down and says that in the end, discharges and discharge in the navigable waters is going to be read the same as discharge of a pollutant. The term discharge, when used without qualification, includes discharge of a pollutant and discharge of pollutants. That comes from the Clean Water Act itself. The court relies on that language to say that even just saying discharge into navigable waters still means discharge of a pollutant, which means then point source. So this is the effort to address through 401 non-point sources, which ultimately fails. Any questions on that?
How did that make it to the Court of Appeals? It's the same statute, so it obviously means the same thing.
Yeah. Well, you get an appeal by right to the Court of Appeals. So you can appeal anything to the Court of Appeals. It's surprising to me that they wrote on it, because I do think it's a fairly obvious one. But maybe it was a lot of press in the case, something like that. Yeah, I'm not sure why they decided to write on it. All right, and the district court had said, they actually decided it the other way. Right, so the district court decision said that, yeah, these are covered. All right. Any last questions on that? This is the end of 401. All right, so now we're moving to transboundary water pollution, which we're going to cover fairly quickly. So this is fights between states, starting on page 953 here. So we've got the first case here, Missouri v. Illinois 1, a 1901 case. The problem we have is that Illinois was discharging its sewage waste into the Great Lakes, which was also their main water source. Kind of a big deal when you are polluting your water source with your waste, and it leads to typhus, big outbreaks of typhus in Chicago, like Typhoid Mary kind of thing, lots of people getting sick. 1901, when the first case was filed, is shortly after the World's Fair, which was in 1892. Part of the preparations for that, part of the follow-on to that, they actually regraded the Illinois River so that the flow went from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River instead of the other direction. So we're changing the direction of the river, and that way, when you discharge your wastes into the Illinois River, it was going into the Mississippi River and going off downstream, not out into your own drinking water, which, if you're Chicago, is great, right? That's really nice. You don't have to worry about fouling your water supply. If you're the people downstream in Missouri, now you're drinking water that has typhoid in it. That's coming all the way from upstream in Illinois, and it led to a big increase in the amount of typhoid in St. Louis in particular, which is right there on the Mississippi River, and was at that point pulling its water from that river, and we didn't really have, if you'll recall, much in the way of water treatment around 1901. So we get a nuisance case in Missouri v. Illinois. Supreme Court says it has jurisdiction to hear it, and that there is a cause of action for nuisance there. This is the follow-on case of that when it comes back to the Supreme Court. And there the Supreme Court says there's no pretense this is a nuisance of the simple kind known to older common law. There's nothing which can be detected by the unassisted senses, no visible increase in filth, no new smell. Maybe there's some magical thing in the water that's making you sick. But absent these kind of normal nuisance things we're thinking about, the court declines to find that Missouri is suffering a nuisance due to Illinois rerouting the river and sending their stuff downstream. Remember, we don't really get germ theory very well at this point. Medicine isn't really a thing yet. You're getting like snake oil salesmen. Washing hands between patients isn't a thing yet. So this idea of these waterborne pathogens making these folks sick is a tough sell, and certainly the Supreme Court doesn't buy it. So then we get another case in 1981 and says that this federal common law that the Supreme Court created or said existed in 1902 and 1906 is superseded by the Clean Water Act. So the only way, there's no longer a tort solution at the federal level between states. There is still, we've had this in international paper, there is still state common law claims, and you can claim within one state against another state. You use the law of the polluting state when you're doing that. So that puts the polluted state at a disadvantage. Illinois says, hey, it's fine to discharge sewage waste, then Missouri can't make any claim because they're preempted by, or prevented rather, by Illinois state law. So there is still state common law claims, no federal common law claims. Generally, the Clean Water Act is the way that you address this. And there's two ways to address transboundary problems under the Clean Water Act. first, going back to 401, so if there's a federal discharger, the lower state can get a hearing with a licensing agency in the upper state if that federal discharger in the upstream state is going to cause water quality standard violations for the lower state. And under the language of the Clean Water Act, the licensing agency in the upper state shall condition such licenses or permits in such manner as may be necessary to ensure compliance with applicable water quality requirements. Okay, so under 401, if the upstream polluter is federal or if there's a federal hook, you can use 401 to force the upstream state to condition those permits on, in whatever way essentially the lower state needs. Does that make sense? So that's pretty strong. That's the way you'd want to do it. We get a Supreme Court case on this one. This is 1992, Arkansas v. Oklahoma. It says Section 401A2 appears to prohibit the issuance of any federal license or permit over the objection of an affected state, meaning a downstream state, unless compliance with the affected state's water quality requirements can be ensured. So really you have a veto there. This was NPDES permit given to the city of Fayetteville, Arkansas for their new sewage treatment plant. And it was discharging about 40 miles upstream of the Arkansas-Oklahoma border and was causing violations of California's water quality standards for the Illinois River. Not the Illinois River we were talking about earlier, a different Illinois River, the one that's in Oklahoma. I think there's another one out here that's in like Washington or maybe Northern California. That's a big rafting river. Okay, so we have essentially a veto under 401 if it's federal. If it's not federal, you don't have that. 402 does give some other options here. So to get your NPDES permitting authority, the state must ensure that any state other than the permitting state whose waters may be affected by the issuance of the permit. So if you're getting authority to do NPDES permits, you have to make sure that any other state can submit written comments to the written recommendations to the permitting state and the EPA administrator with respect to any permit application that may impact that downstream state. So when you're creating your system, you have to allow downstream states to at least complain about it. So let them submit comments, and if any part of such written recommendations aren't accepted, the permitting state will notify the affected state and the administrator of its failure to accept the recommendations along with its reasons for doing so. Okay, so you have to give them an opportunity to complain, notice, and then you have to tell them the upstream state afterwards has to tell them if they don't accept those standards and tell them why. And that's really about it. You can't make them do it. There's not a way to force them to take your recommendations. The EPA could step in after you complain. If the EPA thinks that this action wasn't okay, the EPA isn't generally going to do that. So for the federal ones, we've got 401, which is strong. Under 402, we get very little support. So for non-federal actions, it's really hard to reach those. Did you have a question, Jeremy?
So anytime Colorado issues a permit, they have to consider for water that's going to run through Arizona into California, they have to consider both California standards and Arizona standards?
They have to give notice to California and to Arizona and then let those states comment on the decision to issue that permit or not comment. Right, so ensure that any state whose waters may be affected may submit written recommendations to the permitting state. So when they're making this decision, they have to say, hey, we're going to issue this NPDES permit. If you want to comment on it, you can.
So in practice, if it's actually bad, then California would just talk to the EPA, and the
So-
EPA would step in?
So California then would submit these recommendations. Colorado either takes those recommendations or doesn't take those recommendations. If they don't, they have to tell the downstream state and the EPA administrator that it didn't do it and explain why it didn't do it. EPA can step in then and force them to for that particular permit. They don't have to, and generally they don't. Yeah.
Basically, it's kind of asked the same questions that I have to do a little more on. So could a state like in California essentially extort Colorado or some other upstream state by having some completely unreasonable water standard?
Well, one, we'd have to meet the standard ourselves, and we like to use our rivers as dumping grounds too, which makes it hard. Under 401 you could, right? Because you have that veto under 401 if it's a federal thing. But if it's a state one, if you're under 402, there's no punch for the extortion because they can just wave us off and say, no, we're not going to accept it. Here's why. And more likely than not, yeah, the EPA isn't going to do anything about it. So, all right. Questions on that? The other major way to handle these transboundary issues are interstate compacts. We have, this is way back to constitutional law. We get a throwback moment. Article 1, Section 10 says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state. The implication is then that you could enter into a compact or an agreement with another state if you can get the consent of Congress. And so we have a number of compacts that deal with water quality. The biggest one is the Tahoe Regional Planning Compact, which creates the Tahoe Regional Planning Authority to handle water quality at Lake Tahoe. Right? This is the whole Keep Tahoe Blue thing. And it's an interstate compact between California and Nevada to implement water quality planning and regulations for the lake. We also have the Colorado River Compact. Not so much, there's some water quality stuff. It's mostly about water quantity and keeping salinity low enough that it's usable. But once you create these, and then once Congress approves them, they're enforceable as federal law. So they essentially become federal law once they're in place. All right, so one big question we've talked about a little bit is the stormwater issue. So if you've got a city and it's got a lot of stormwater sewage drain things to handle stormwater runoff, this should all look fairly familiar. A storm water drain like you've seen on your street, it's just dug out a little bit. It's where the it clown hides. This is a pipe, right, where the water is coming out of a whole bunch of these that have come together. This is actually behind the house that we still own back in Kansas. There's a lovely creek back there, but it was eating into somebody's yard, and so they complained, and they got the whole thing put into a pipe. That's before I was there. But this pipe's like 8 feet tall, and you can go and explore in it and see the clam. Yeah, I used to ride my bike through these little things. But this is discharging stormwater. That stormwater has pollutants. It's coming from a point, right? That looks a lot like a point source, except that it's a collection of a whole bunch of non-point sources into a point source. And so the question was, is this covered or not? This is a kind of an old school storm sewer drain, but that's actually one that was in downtown Lawrence underground from 90, 100 years ago, old limestone thing. So this comes up in NRDC v. Coastal at the DC Circuit in 1977. The Circuit Court says that storm sewers meet the technical definition of a point source. It's a point, pollutants are coming out. EPA had attempted to exempt all of these sources, and the DC Circuit says the Clean Water Act does not permit kind of these wholesale exemptions. Just because it's inconvenient to deal with this problem doesn't mean that the EPA can exempt them. Congress could step in and exempt them, but the EPA couldn't do it. So that leads into, in the 1987 Clean Water Act amendments, kind of a formalization, a legislation of the same holding from that court to say a discharge permit is required for any discharges from large or medium municipal storm sewer systems, any discharge from those systems that contribute to violation of water quality standards, and any discharge associated with industrial activity. And that leads us into the stormwater prevention plans. So states, for cities need these stormwater prevention plans. And then construction sites, any construction site that covers more than an acre is required to get an NPDES permit. Includes a site description, measures that you're going to use to keep the runoff from that site from creating pollutants. What are the big pollutants you think you'd see from a construction site? Sediment. Sediment's a huge one. And this is why I don't know if you all are young enough to remember it, or old enough to remember it, but it used to be that you'd see these construction sites and there weren't the hay bales, they weren't the straw like tubes that look like, I don't know, like a stocking with straw stuffed into it they put in front of your stormwater drains. They didn't used to have those. Historically, there was none of that stuff. And you just wash huge amounts of sediment from construction sites into the stormwater system and then downstream into streams and lakes. Now, whenever you see these construction sites, you see these rolled out mats of straw, you see hay bales stuck into the ground. Those things are all designed to slow the water down enough that as the water moves through, you're going to get clean water and the sediment's going to be trapped upstream. If it gets to the stormwater drain, that tube is supposed to keep the water going through and stop the sediment from going through. So historically, those weren't required until this 1987 amendments, and those actually didn't kick in until close to 2000. So that's when those things really started popping up. One of the big problems that we still have with these sewer systems are what we call combined sewer systems. They're subject to the same NPDES requirements everybody else is subject to, except that these are waived under certain wet conditions. What a combined sewer is that during dry periods, they carry sanitary sewage. I don't know why we call it, we should call it unsanitary sewage. But it's the gross stuff that comes from the house, offices, factories, all the stuff that normally goes to your publicly owned treatment plant. It carries that stuff to the publicly owned treatment plant. And then when it rains, it also carries storm water to that treatment plant. And under kind of average conditions or dry conditions, all of that stuff gets treated and it's fine. But when you have a big storm, you get a big wet period, that storm water overwhelms the system and you end up flushing out a whole bunch of untreated sewage and storm water into your lakes and rivers. So you get lovely signs like this. This stream receives stormwater runoff and combined sewage during rain and snowmelt. Contact with the water can make you sick. For recorded river quality information, please call blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's really strong enough, right? It's like, there's poop in the water. Don't go in the water. These things are common, especially, this is based mostly on when these cities were settled and when the cities were really built up. And so a lot of our older cities, and a number of older cities on the West Coast still have these combined sewage systems. And every time it rains, you get some release of nasty stuff into the river. Generally, we have best management practices, not effluent limits for these things. So during dry conditions, you have to treat everything. During wet conditions, we're just gonna have some stuff discharge. It's hugely expensive to change these systems out. Think about digging in and creating a new sewage system under a city. Very difficult, very expensive to do. And I have a little video. I've looked at all of the videos and I found this to be the best one, even though it's from Canada. It's the same poop wherever you go. What's that kid's book? Everybody Poops? I think that's the... Yes, it smells sweeter. It's really gross. Is that too far? Maybe it's too far.
Most of us don't spend a lot of time thinking about the infrastructure beneath our feet. When we wash the dishes, empty the bathtub, or flush our toilets, a lot happens underground. Out of sight and out of mind. So what does happen underground? Well, Winnipeg has a lot in common with other North American cities. During the past 2 centuries, we've grown from a small town to a thriving city. At first, a combined sewer system carried both land drainage and sewage to the river. Then in the 1930s, Winnipeg began treating its sewage at the newly opened North End sewage treatment plant. Other sewage treatment plants were built later. The existing system had to be modified. Weir walls and interceptor pipes were installed at each outfall. During dry weather, the weir walls act as dams, preventing the sewage from entering the river, while the interceptor pipes move the wastewater into the city's sewage treatment plants. During heavy rainfall, when the system is no longer able to divert everything to sewage treatment plants, the weir walls allow the diluted sewage to spill over the top into the river. This is referred to as a combined sewer overflow, or CSO. CSOs happen an average of 22 times per year at each outfall. When a CSO occurs, it releases diluted sewage into the river, but it also helps prevent sewer backups that could result in serious damage to property. Starting in the 1970s, as standards changed, the city moved away from combined sewers and began constructing separate sewers. These new designs use separate pipes for runoff and sewage. Sewage always flows to the treatment plant, and runoff always flows to the river. While combined sewers aren't ideal today, they were the standard all over the continent for decades, and 32% of Winnipeg is still serviced by more than 1,000 kilometers of this infrastructure. The goal for most cities is to reduce the number of CSOs. This is a significant and costly undertaking with many factors to consider. The City of Winnipeg is working in many ways to reduce the number of combined sewer overflows that occur in the current system. These include installing computer monitoring systems that provide early detection of high sewer levels, improving the existing pumps and weir walls, replacing combined sewers with separate ones as opportunities arise, and developing a long-term plan to continue to manage CSOs. While none of us wants to see potentially harmful material released into our waterways, the City of Winnipeg is only one of many sources discharging to our rivers. Waste from other communities and runoff from agricultural and industrial activities all enter the rivers before they reach Winnipeg. However, by reducing CSOs, we will be doing our part to help protect the water quality of our rivers in Lake Winnipeg. This is the combined sewer during dry conditions. There is little or no runoff, and all the sewage is moved out of the combined sewers by interceptor pipes and pumps. It all gets treated by Winnipeg sewage treatment plants before being released to the Assiniboine and Red Rivers, which merge and flow into Lake Winnipeg. This is the combined sewer during periods of light rainfall or light snowmelt. There's a lot more runoff entering the sewers and mixing with the sewage, but the weir walls, interceptors, and pumps are all designed to handle volume like this. Everything makes it to the sewage treatment plants, and nothing flows into the river. This is the combined sewer during heavy rainfall or rapid snowmelt. The interceptors and pumps still move sewage to the sewage treatment plants, but when volumes get too high, overflows may occur. Diluted sewage flows over the weir walls and into the river, rather than backing up into the sewer system. These events occur an average of 22 times per year at each outfall.
A little repetition there so you don't forget it. We still have these out here. This is San Francisco has a combined sewer system. I think Sacramento doesn't. Those of you who did the Stockton tour last year, do you remember if Stockton has a combined sewer?
Is it San Francisco and it's flowing to the
I
ocean?
don't remember.
Yeah, it goes into the ocean. I can't remember on Stockton either.
Those are those bathrooms are ocean beach that go
I think Stockton just got away from theirs.
I mean, cities don't want to use this because it's more expensive because you have to treat all of that rainfall too, right? So cities don't want it, but it's just super expensive to change that stuff out. All right, I will post up the new readings from Monday tonight. Yes, I will do it tonight. It's going to be great. And it is. Just going to cut loose. Me, some scotch, and some readings. And yeah, we'll see you all on Monday. Good work today, folks.